A young woman collapses in a Jakarta cafe, her final breath taken between sips of iced coffee and conversation. Within moments, a simple reunion turned into a national spectacle. One friend was dead, the other became the prime suspect. This is the story of the Cyanide Coffee Case. Jessica Wongso's behavior raised eyebrows. She arrived early, never touched the drink she ordered, and stayed oddly composed in the aftermath. While suspicion grew, the forensic evidence didn't. No cyanide container, no clear toxicological confirmation, no autopsy. Still, the case played out in full view of the public. Courtroom cameras rolled, headlines exploded, and after months of debate, Jessica was found guilty, not through direct proof, but through circumstantial evidence that told a compelling story. I'm the narrator, and this is CrimeSynth. Today, we ask, in a case like this, where suspicion is high but proof is thin, what does it take to get it right? On January 6, 2016, in Jakarta, Indonesia, at exactly 3:33 p.m., Jessica Kumala Wongso arrives alone at the Olivier Cafe, located inside the Grand Indonesia Mall. She selects a table near the window and places her order, a Vietnamese iced coffee specifically requested for her friend Mina, and 2 cocktails. Surveillance footage captures her every move. Prosecutors would later argue that her behavior that afternoon was unusually deliberate and suspicious. Just before 4:24 p.m., the iced coffee is served. Jessica remains seated, never sipping the drink. She waits alone for nearly an hour. Then at 5:16 p.m., Mina Selhan and Hani Jugita arrive. It's a casual reunion among college friends, or so it seems. Mina takes her seat, smiles, lifts the tall glass of iced coffee to her lips, and takes a sip. Within a minute, everything changes. Mina begins to convulse. Her body shakes. Foam gathers at her mouth. Panic spreads across the cafe. At 5:20 p.m., she's rushed to the Abdi Waluyo Hospital, but within hours, Mina Selhan is pronounced dead. In the chaos, Jessica speaks to Mina's father, telling him she drank only water, but this contradicts the cafe's sales records. She had ordered and paid for alcohol. It's the first of the several inconsistencies that investigators would later cite. No full autopsy was ever performed. Mina's body is embalmed shortly after her passing, a decision that would leave forensic experts with more questions than answers. What began as a casual coffee meetup would soon become Indonesia's most scrutinized criminal case of the decade. In trials like these, the person at the center, the one whose life was lost, can sometimes become the quietest part of the story. Wayan Mina Selhan was more than a courtroom name. A 27-year-old graphic designer, recently married and known for her warmth and loyalty, Mina was building a promising life. She had studied in Australia, where she met Jessica Wongso. Their friendship grew and their closeness seemed undeniable. Who knew that what began as a beautiful relationship would end in such a disaster? At one point, during their time in Australia, they arranged to meet up. Mina brought Arif, her boyfriend, now her husband. But Jessica hadn't expected that. She believed it would be just the two of them. This was also the time when Mina had told Jessica, "He's not right for you." That moment, according to those close to them, marked the beginning of a shift, subtle at first, but irreversible. Jessica reportedly did not take the comment well. What was meant as concern may have been received as betrayal. Though no one could confirm the full details of that conversation, what followed was a noticeable cooling of their friendship. Texts became less frequent, distance grew, and beneath the surface, something festered. In the days before her death, Mina confided to her friends that she no longer trusted Jessica. Still, she agreed to meet her that day at the cafe. We saw her on CCTV. We learned about her final moments. but we never truly heard from her. No texts, no emails, no calls from Mina were ever shown in court. Her emotional state, her physical health, her mental well-being, all left untouched, unexplored. And perhaps most critically, no autopsy was ever performed, which means the most important medical questions were never answered. What stress might she have been carrying? What symptoms did she never speak about? Could she have had something undiagnosed? Something hidden, waiting to surface? Her family believed she was healthy, but belief is not the same as certainty. And the investigation? It never looked closely enough to find out. If justice was meant to speak for Mina, why did it leave her so silent? The case advanced without a full picture of her life or death. In court, Mina became a backdrop. Her health, stress, digital footprint, absent. The narrative instead simplified her and Jessica's dynamic into a binary: innocent victim versus jealous friend. But human relationships are rarely that clear-cut. Mina's story, like the case itself, was full of silences, and in that silence, the investigation moved forward, not by what was known, but by what was presumed. These missing layers, medical, emotional, digital, were never filled in. Instead, the courtroom took center stage. What began as a personal tragedy between friends became a national trial, and at its center was Jessica Wongso. The prosecution built a story from fragments, subtle behaviors, inconsistencies, timing, and psychological indicators. In the absence of direct forensic proof, that story became their most persuasive weapon. Jessica Komalo Wongso's early arrival at the cafe, 90 minutes before her friends, was framed as suspicious. Prosecutors argued that this window provided her the opportunity to tamper with a drink. They focused on her strategic placement of shopping bags on the table, partially obstructing the CCTV's view of the iced coffee, interpreting it as a deliberate move to conceal her actions. When the Vietnamese iced coffee was served, Jessica didn't taste it and never drank from her own order. That refusal was framed as an anticipatory knowledge that the drink was poisoned. Minutes later, Mina collapsed. The prosecution argued this sequence was not coincidence but calculated. Jessica's behavior in the moments that followed intensified suspicion. While others panicked, she remained calm and emotionally restrained. While composure isn't proof of guilt, prosecutors leaned on cultural expectations. A grieving friend would cry, panic, or show visible anguish, not remain stone-faced, or worse, smile. To many Indonesians, this restraint contradicted the expected norms of femininity and friendship. Her inconsistencies also came under scrutiny. Jessica told Myrna's father that she only drank water, yet cafe receipts showed she had ordered alcohol. The prosecution used this contradiction to suggest deliberate deception, implying she was hiding something more consequential. But what exactly? According to the prosecution's theory, Jessica had acquired cyanide in the days prior, allegedly researching poisons online and planning the act in advance. They argued she introduced the substance into the coffee before it was served, though they never recovered a container or physical trace linking her directly to the toxin. The method of delivery was never definitively proven, but the prosecution suggested it may have involved contaminating the glass itself or the straw during the window before service. Her alleged motive was rooted in a personal rift. Prosecutors argued that Mina had warned Jessica to end her relationship with her boyfriend. This was a betrayal that Jessica reportedly took personally. Their formerly close friendship had turned cold, and prosecutors painted the murder as a form of personal vengeance cloaked in a casual cafe reunion. They also invoked Jessica's past, her reported suicide attempts in Australia, emotional volatility, and police reports documenting conflicts with a former boyfriend and employer. Though she had never been convicted of any violence, these details were used to suggest a pattern of obsessive and self-destructive behavior. Two expert witnesses bolstered this characterization. Dr. Riza Indragiri Amriel, a forensic psychologist, described Jessica as manipulative and exhibiting narcissistic tendencies. Indonesian police referenced a psychological report labeling her as a potential narcissistic psychopath. While this diagnosis was never formally submitted as a medical evidence and was contested, it fed into the prosecution's overarching narrative that Jessica's internal instability made her capable of calculated harm. To support their toxicological claims, prosecutors referenced forensic literature to explain how trace cyanide, approximately 0.2 milligrams, was found in Myrna's stomach contents days after her death. But this finding clashed with scientific standards. Dr. Jaja Surya Atmaja, a forensic pathologist and defense expert, testified that the lethal dose of cyanide ranges between 50 to 176 milligrams, far exceeding than what was detected. Furthermore, without a full autopsy, there was no definitive medical conclusion about what truly caused Myrna's death. Yet none of this deterred the court. In Indonesia's battle model justice system, there are no juries, just 3 judges who evaluate both evidence and demeanor. Here, the prosecution's story didn't need to prove how Jessica committed the crime in forensic detail. It needed to persuade the judges that behavior, the timing, and the psychological profile formed a pattern of premeditation. This case reflects what Presser and Sandberg describe in narrative criminology, which is the idea that compelling stories, especially in the absence of hard science, can override evidentiary gaps. In this courtroom, the prosecution's narrative became the connective tissue, and for the judges, it was enough. While the prosecution assembled a narrative of premeditated guilt, the defense presented a counter case grounded not in speculation but in absence of proof, of forensic certainty, and of due process. Their argument was clear. Too many critical questions remain unanswered to convict beyond reasonable doubt. At the heart of their challenge was the lack of a full autopsy. In a case hinging on sudden, unnatural death, this omission left the cause medically unverified. Forensic pathologist Dr. Jaja Surya Atmaja testified that without a proper autopsy, it was impossible to conclude whether cyanide was the cause or whether Myrna's collapse might have stemmed from a natural condition, an undiagnosed allergy, or even a reaction to something entirely unrelated. Compounding this uncertainty was the toxicology timeline. The first test, performed 70 minutes after the death, showed no trace of cyanide. Only 3 days later did a secondary test detect 0.2 milligrams in her stomach contents, a quantity far below the lethal threshold of 50 to 176 milligrams. Experts questioned whether this trace could have come from post-mortem changes, embalming chemicals, or contamination. Contamination, the defense argued, was not hypothetical. It was demonstrable. The contents of the iced coffee glass, the alleged vessel of poisoning, were transferred to another container mid-trial. This breach of forensic protocol rendered the chain of custody broken. In a case where the drink was central, its integrity was anything but. Moreover, no cyanide container was ever recovered. No physical evidence linked Jessica to the poison, not in her possession, her bag, her clothing, or her digital devices. Investigators offered no proof of acquisition or delivery. The prosecution's assertion that she must have disposed of it rested not on evidence, but on inference. The defense also drew attention to other silences. Myrna's medical history, which was never explored. Had she suffered from an underlying cardiac or metabolic condition? Was she on any medications? Could a rare anaphylactic reaction have played a role? With no autopsy, these questions were not overlooked. They were impossible to answer. Likewise, Myrna's digital footprint and emotional state were absent from court. No texts, no emails, no voice messages from the days before her death were presented. Did she express fear, sadness, or health concerns? The courtroom never heard from her, only about her. And yet, as the prosecution's forensic case faltered, it was Jessica's behavior that came under increasing scrutiny. Her composure, her silence, her lack of visible grief. The defense argued this was not evidence, it was misinterpretation. Psychological experts pointed to the impact of trauma, shock, or even neurodivergence in shaping emotional response. But no formal psychological evaluation was introduced to clarify Jessica's demeanor. Instead, the court leaned on paralinguistic cues, body language, eye movement, referenced by legal expert Eddie O.S. Hiariej in the Netflix documentary Ice Cold. But empirical research by Virij, Mann and Fisher, and Sporer and Schwant has shown these indicators are scientifically unreliable in detecting deception. This is where attribution theory becomes key. Proposed by Fritz Heider and later expanded by Lee Ross, the theory explains how people attribute others' behavior to internal character rather than external context. Jessica didn't cry, she didn't collapse, she didn't perform grief in the way people expected, and so guilt was projected onto her silence. But does calmness in crisis mean culpability, or does it simply mean we didn't understand what we were seeing? In the defense's view, the court blurred the lines between judging behavior and proving guilt. The standard in criminal law is not likelihood, but proof beyond reasonable doubt. Jessica's legal team argued that when the cause of death is unconfirmed, the toxin unproven, the link to the accused missing, and the evidence mishandled, then doubt is not a loophole, it is a legal safeguard. They also reminded the court of a fundamental principle, presumption of innocence. Jessica did not have to prove she was innocent. The state had to prove she was guilty. And if the system couldn't offer clear answers, only assumptions and expectations, then the only fair verdict was not conviction, but caution. Step by step, the case foundation crumbled. No autopsy, no toxin in the first toxicology, a mishandled drink sample, no container, no direct link, no motive established beyond conjecture. In the end, the defense warned that justice based on assumption is no justice at all. That to convict someone in the void of forensic certainty is not resolution, it's risk. And that the burden of proof must be higher than public pressure, cultural norms, or emotional logic. Because sometimes what seems clear isn't true. The trial of Jessica Wongso wasn't just a legal proceeding, it became a televised national event with daily live broadcasts and minute-by-minute media coverage. The courtroom turned into a public stage where perception often held as much weight as procedure. Indonesia operates under a civil law system rooted in Dutch colonial legal heritage, where trials are conducted without a jury. Instead, a panel of 3 judges assumes both investigative and adjudicative roles, examining facts, questioning witnesses, and ultimately delivering the verdict. Although not a fully adversarial system like those in the US or UK, Indonesian criminal trials incorporate adversarial features with an inquisitorial structure, particularly during cross-examination and evidentiary debates. In this system, the interpretation of demeanor and emotion can take on critical importance, especially in the absence of definitive forensic evidence. That's where culture steps in. In Indonesian society, emotional expression, especially from women, is often viewed as a marker of sincerity and virtue. Grief should be visible. A bereaved friend is expected to cry, falter, show emotional pain. Jessica Wongso's composure in court, her lack of visible distress, clashed with those expectations. To many observers, it didn't suggest strength, it signaled coldness. Media commentary amplified this interpretation. She was labeled as the ice-hearted killer. Television hosts and online discussions speculated on her lack of remorse. Her stillness became a subject of scrutiny even more than the ambiguous evidence itself. This phenomenon is explained by attribution theory. The theory posits that when people observe behavior, especially behavior that deviates from expectations, they tend to attribute it to internal traits rather than external circumstances. In Jessica's case, her calm demeanor was widely interpreted as a reflection of her character: manipulative, detached, guilty. Yet alternative explanations, shock, neurodivergence, psychological trauma were rarely considered. This cultural and psychological lens didn't just shape public opinion, it also bled into the courtroom. And when the facts of the case were fragmented or inconclusive, the narrative structure of the trial became increasingly important. This is where narrative criminology becomes relevant. As proposed by Presser and Sandberg, this theoretical lens suggests that in criminal justice, stories often substitute for missing evidence. Prosecutors construct narratives to explain motive, timing, and behavior. In this case, Jessica's silence became a plot device. Her early arrival, her posture in court, even her neutral facial expressions were all repurposed into narrative threads that aligned with guilt. The story felt coherent even if the science behind it was contested. In a system without a jury, and with public sentiment surrounding the case, these narrative and emotional cues may have played an outsized role. Judges, like any observers, are not immune to culturally conditioned expectations. When justice is shaped as much by emotion and narrative as by evidence, the question isn't just whether the verdict was legal, it's whether it was understood through the right lens. If Jessica Wongso were guilty, psychology offers a plausible explanation rooted in the concept of narcissistic rage. According to Runningstem, individuals with narcissistic traits may experience intense anger and a desire for retribution when they perceive threats to their self-esteem or autonomy. This rage is not always overt. It can manifest as calculated, cold, and emotionally detached actions. In the case of Jessica Wongso, several factors align with this framework. She initiated the meeting with Mina Selhan and arrived at the cafe nearly 2 hours early, ordering drinks and placing a shopping bag on the table, which momentarily obscured the view of the drinks from CCTV cameras. Psychologist Antonia Ratti testified that Jessica's behavior was abnormal, suggesting a possible underlying psychological disturbance. Additionally, reports from the Australian Federal Police indicated that Jessica had a history of mental health issues, including suicide attempts and erratic behavior. If Myrna's advice to Jessica to end a toxic relationship was perceived as a personal affront, it could have triggered a narcissistic injury, leading to a calculated act of revenge. In this context, Jessica's calm demeanor during the trial and her lack of visible remorse could be interpreted as emotional detachment characteristic of narcissistic rage. Alternatively, the same behaviors can be interpreted through a different lens. Jessica Wongso and Mina Selhan studied together at Billy Blue College of Design in Sydney, and Jessica worked as a graphic designer for NSW Ambulance. There is no evidence to suggest that Jessica had any training in chemistry or toxicology. Jessica's early arrival at the cafe could be seen as eagerness to reunite with friends. Her placement of the shopping bag on the table might have been a casual act with no ulterior motive. Regarding her demeanor, research indicates that individuals respond to trauma in varied ways, and a lack of visible emotion does not necessarily indicate guilt. Furthermore, cultural norms influence expressions of emotion. In some cultures, maintaining a composure in public is valued, and overt displays of emotion may be discouraged. Therefore, Jessica's behavior during the trial could reflect cultural expectations rather than psychological pathology. The forensic evidence in the case was also contested. Forensic toxicologist Michael Robertson testified that there was no toxicological evidence of cyanide ingestion, as cyanide was not detected in the victim's stomach contents, bile, liver, or urine. Given these considerations, it's plausible that Jessica's actions and demeanor were misinterpreted, and the evidence may not conclusively support a guilty verdict. Jessica Kumalo Wongso's life before the trial was marked by complexity and nuance. Born in Jakarta and later residing in Sydney, she pursued a career in graphic design and worked for the New South Wales Ambulance Service. Her personal history, however, became a focal point during the trial. with aspects of her past scrutinized and at times sensationalized. Court documents and media reports reveal that Jessica had experienced significant emotional distress prior to the incident. According to the Australian Federal Police, she had a history of self-harm and had written a suicide note in November 2015. Additionally, she had been involved in multiple car accidents, one of which involved crashing into a nursing home. These incidents were presented by the prosecution to suggest a pattern of instability. During the trial, psychologist Antonia Ratti testified that Jessica exhibited abnormal behavior, describing her as intelligent but emotionally unstable. However, the defense challenged the validity of this assessment, arguing that psychological examination conducted at the police station was unjustifiable and lacked proper authorization. The interpretation of Jessica's demeanor became a contentious point. Her calm and composed behavior in court was perceived by some as a lack of remorse, fueling public suspicion. Attribution theory explains how individuals tend to attribute others' behavior to internal characteristics rather than external circumstances. In Jessica's case, her reserved demeanor was interpreted as indicative of guilt, without considering alternative explanations such as cultural differences in emotional expression or the psychological impact of being on trial. Furthermore, the narrative constructed around Jessica's character played a significant role in shaping public opinion. Narrative criminology posits that the stories told about individuals in the criminal justice system can influence perceptions of guilt or innocence. Media coverage and courtroom narratives painted Jessica in a negative light, emphasizing her past and courtroom behavior over concrete evidence. Despite the intense scrutiny, Jessica maintained her innocence throughout the trial. In the Netflix documentary Ice Cold: Murder, Coffee, and Jessica Wongso, she expressed confusion over the accusations and the media portrayal of her character. Her defense team argued that the lack of direct evidence linking her to the crime, combined with procedural flaws in the investigation, warranted reasonable doubt. Understanding Jessica Wongso as a person, the emotional turbulence she carried, the stoic posture she presented, the polarizing interpretations she triggered was essential context. Yet in the courtroom, that context was not necessarily weighed as complexity. It became narrative material. After months of testimony, public commentary, and international scrutiny, the judges reached their decision. Indonesia's criminal justice system placed the responsibility of determining guilt solely in the hands of 3 judges. Without a jury, these judges must interpret not only the facts but also the nuances of behavior, emotion, and motive. In this case, the legal decision leaned not on conclusive science but on a pattern of prosecution successfully constructed: opportunity, motive, and demeanor. Jessica's emotional restraint, her early arrival at the cafe, and her inconsistent statements became the spine of that narrative. Her defense team raised critical gaps: no full autopsy, questionable toxicology results, broken chain of custody, and no cyanide residue linked to Jessica. These arguments introduced doubt, but not enough to dismantle the overarching storyline of intent. The absence of physical evidence did not negate the presence of a story the court found cohesive and believable. This brings us again to narrative criminology. In cases where forensic or testimonial certainty is lacking, the story told in court can become the substitute for proof. A person's life, choices, and even psychology become characters in a plot that persuades, not just informs. And persuade it did. Jessica Wongso was convicted of premeditated murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Despite the forensic ambiguity, the circumstantial pattern was, in the judge's eyes, enough. The courtroom didn't merely deliver a verdict, it accepted a compelling narrative in place of scientific finality. Despite weak forensic evidence, Jessica was sentenced to 20 years in prison, convicted on circumstantial evidence alone. The pattern felt compelling enough for the judges, but was it just a persuasive story? In the end, the courtroom became less a forum for uncovering what is and more a stage for what felt convincing. The prosecution told a coherent story, one of emotional betrayal, strategic behavior, and a carefully timed act. They relied on surveillance footage, behavior patterns, and psychological characterizations to imply guilt. Even without a cyanide container, eyewitnesses, or clear toxicology confirmation, the narrative carried force. It answered the question of motive. It framed Jessica's restraint as callous, and it persuaded the judges. The defense, in contrast, dismantled the case from a forensic and procedural standpoint. They challenged the lack of an autopsy, the absence of direct physical evidence, the contaminated coffee sample, and the inconsistencies in toxicology. They reminded the court and the public that Jessica's behavior could be misread through culturally tinted lenses, and that emotional composure is not proof of guilt. That doubt in a system built on the presumption of innocence should be protective, not inconvenient. What this case reveals is not just the fragility of evidence, but the fragility of interpretation. It shows how courts, when left to weigh emotion, behavior, and circumstantial threads, may conflate a plausible story with a proven truth. It raises deeper concerns too. What happens when legal systems prioritize closure over comprehension? When behavior is judged without psychological grounding? When media saturation amplifies suspicion before the first verdict is even heard? And what if the law made a close call because Jessica did commit the crime, but the evidence couldn't keep up? On the other hand, what if she was truly innocent, and the courtroom simply became the final chapter of a story already written in the court of public opinion? If Jessica is guilty, Mina deserved clear justice. If Jessica is innocent, both women deserve the truth. But when the truth itself is built on fragments, what certainty do we really have? Sometimes, justice doesn't clear doubts, it deepens them. And if doubt can convict as easily as it can protect, then what kind of justice system are we really left with? Whether Jessica did it or not, no one can truly say for sure. What we do know is this: Mina is gone, and with no autopsy, that truth is sealed forever. The verdict has been read. The grief cannot be undone, but what can be changed is the system that allows uncertainty to stand in for proof, a system where absence of evidence is filled with assumption, where behavior becomes evidence, and where someone could be punished not for what was proven, but for what was believed. That's what should disturb us, because even if this case was judged correctly, the next one might not be. This has been the narrator, and you're watching CrimeSynth. Subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell. Comment below, was justice served or shaped by assumption? Stay tuned for the next story and tell us, what case should we explore next?